Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell of the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, where we look into the science, health, and well-being of families. Today we tackle a grave subject that is experienced by several, one that is of incredible importance, one that requires sensitivity, rebuilding life after domestic violence. And on that note, if you are in Australia and are or know someone who has experienced or is at risk of family and domestic violence, call 1-800-737-732. Now, domestic violence is pervasive and persistent, affecting individuals and families across all walks of life. The journey to healing and empowerment after experiencing such trauma can be long, complicated, and challenging. And so today we're speaking to the Executive Director of NYU Center on Violence and Recovery to learn more about what awaits survivors down this road and what we can do if we know someone in our families who's struggling with this. Our guest for today is a practitioner and national advocate for using restorative approaches to address the root causes of violence and counteract the harms caused by the United States punitive criminal legal system. And she's none other than Krystal McLeod. Hi, Krystal. It's lovely having you on the show. How are you going today?
Hi, Marie. It's a gift to be here with you. I'm doing really well and just so excited to be here and to be talking about this really important issue. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to learning more from you too. Now, before we begin, could you tell us a bit about your role as the Executive Director of NYU Center on Violence and Recovery? What does it entail? What kind of projects does the center focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a global center, a global restorative justice center that is doing work at the intersection of violence, recovery, and restorative justice. We were founded in 2004 by Linda G. Mills, the 17th president of NYU. And Linda came to the commitment of research around violence as a practitioner herself and a social scientist, and recognizing that the treatments we had to address domestic violence were not getting to the root causes of the violence. And through asking these questions around what could an alternative or another way look like, found restorative justice. And that history, that legacy underpins our work today. Now we are doing work in a number of communities across the country, using restorative practices to address domestic violence. We've done rigorous research on the subject, showing that not only can you use restorative justice to address domestic violence, and you can do so safely, but also effectively. And my commitment is I'm deeply committed to finding alternatives for survivors that do want accountability and do want the person who caused them harm, the impact, for them to understand the impact, but are not looking for criminal legal system process or see inadequacies in that process, right? And so that's the work that I'm really excited about and that the center is excited to be doing at this point.
Yeah, that's amazing work that you're doing. And how did you become involved in this line of work and what drives your passion for it?
Yeah, so Ray, I come to this work as a survivor first and foremost. So I'm a survivor of domestic violence and sexual violence. And the person who caused harm to me was my next door neighbor, my family friend, brother's best friend. And it was in that experience during my adolescence years where I had this I got to experience the complexity of having an intersectional identity. So an identity as a woman and a Black woman that was in a relationship and in love with a Black man and wanted him to get the help that he needed to take accountability for the ways in which his behavior had harmed me and caused an incredible amount of real pain and heartache in my life. But I didn't want to move through a criminal legal system process. And at the time, I was in this rock between a really hard place and wanting these things and not having an avenue that I at the time thought that I could get these things through. And so for many years, I didn't speak about my experience and held a lot of that pain, heartache, trauma within myself, but also wanting and really hoping that one day I would be able to be an advocate for alternative pathways for survivors like myself. And so my connection to this work is deeply personal. I recognize within like my own experience and what I've seen through the work in speaking with survivors extensively, that no survivor is the same. And we need to recognize that. We also, I believe that every survivor is an expert on their experience. And they know what they want. And so a part of the U.S. approach to domestic violence has had an element of paternalism in making an assumption about what pathways a survivor must want. And so the work that I'm committed to, and it's connected to my own lived experience, is how do we create a variety of avenues, right? And recognizing that no one survivor is the same, so that a survivor can choose what's going to work best for them and their healing journey. So that's how I come to this work, and I feel really gifted to be able to do this work for others, but also for myself and for what I did, the path that I didn't have years ago.
Yeah, that's great work that you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing that. That was a great introduction to what we're talking about today. And, sharing some of that personal anecdote can really, really contextualize a lot of what we'll be saying today. And it's really important to talk about as well. But before we get further into detail, we'd really like to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Krystal? And my first question for you is, what do you do in your spare time?
Yeah, so I love to read. That's like one of my favorite things to do. And this work for me, like I talk about the work, but like the work is also deeply personal. And so I spend a lot of my time reading on restorative justice, abolition, gender-based violence, trauma, healing, and recovery. I find that really personally powerful. And like I see recovery as a lifelong journey. And if I'm going to be in this work, I think it's really important that I'm doing my own inner work. So I spend a lot of time reading. I also spend a lot of time meditating. So I have this joke with my partner that, at some point, once I reach that 60 point, like I'm moving to Nepal, and you'll see me like somewhere just like meditating all the time. And like, if you come with, like I'm excited. If you don't, it's okay. Like we can have this long distance, situation going on. But yeah, so I really, mindfulness, meditation, contemplative practices have been a really big part of my self-care journey. And my healing journey. So I really enjoy doing that, and connection. Like I'm someone who could spend all day in conversations just like this. I think it's so important. At a really early age, I recognize the importance of family building and building a chosen family, especially for me, like my family of origin had a lot of different complexities. And so the folks that are in relationship with me at this point in my life, so many of them I see a part of that chosen family. And I have so much joy just listening to, like, talking to them, listening to their stories, and just being in deep, nourishing relationships. So those are some of my fun things that I like to do.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that. And with the books that you enjoy reading, are there any, let's say, some of your top favorites that you could share with us?
Absolutely. I have them right here. So one, Changing Lenses. It's by Howard Zier, someone who's seen as a co-architect of the modern restorative justice movement within the United States, recognizing, of course, that restorative justice derives from indigenous wisdom. But I think Howard's conception of restorative justice, or RJ, is just brilliant. And one of my favorite reads also right now, and it's something that I can read over and over again, is Abolition Feminism Now by Angela Davis, Gina Dent, Beth Ritchie, Erica Miners. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is so often, like, we speak about issues not recognizing that all of these systems that have an element of what you would say coercion or domination, they don't operate on their own. They're deeply interconnected. And so I really appreciate feminists that are bringing a feminist analysis to issues like anti-violence, issues like racism. I think it's really important. And so I've been doing a lot of reading there. And another favorite is My Grandmother's Hands. It's a book about what Resmaa calls somatic abolitionism. So what does it mean to, like, a lot of our trauma is held in our bodies, right? And so this is why a lot of survivors of trauma, while talk therapy is important, will also feel like, oh, there's something missing. And that's where this body work becomes so important. So those are a few of my reads that I love to read over and over and over again.
Yeah, incredible. They sound riveting. So we will put them in the show notes as well for anyone who's interested, because they are very much related and intertwined with what we're talking about today. Now, as for podcasts, are there any that you listen to at all?
So I have to be honest, I don't listen to many podcasts, but I am a big Audible person. I love audiobooks.
Yeah, that's completely fair. I feel like podcasts are, like, if you're not an audio kind of person, it can be really difficult to get into. And ironically enough, I was never really much of an audio person. Like, I just never, I would always tune things out. I had to, like, actively train myself to actively listen in order to get into podcasts. So they can be really difficult to get into. So I totally understand. But audiobooks, Audible,
Yeah.
any that are on your radar at the moment?
Yes. So there's this book, and I actually do have a podcast, but I'll say that next. That came to mind. But Rest is Resistance by Trisha Hersey, that talks about the importance of, like, one of the pieces or parts of at least capitalism within the U.S. context is the way in which it has existed through the automation of marginalized bodies, specifically Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies. And so one of the things that Trisha talks about is the importance of rest and pushing against the grain in terms of that my body is only here to work. And what I like to think of, like, is that, like, actually, like, I'm here to be. And this is what the well-being and flourishing space, I think, is so, and it connects to the important work this podcast is doing, is like, what does it mean to allow yourself the ability to rest and be in your aliveness, and for your well-being to be enough, not your being connected to how much you can produce, how much you can do, but just you being here. And I think for a lot of people, that's like a really radical thought. And so this book has been really powerful for me in as someone who my default is to do, to really just allow myself to rest and be. And as you're saying, you go, Marie, please.
Oh no, yeah, I was gonna wholeheartedly agree with that. I feel like in the culture that we're brought up in, where we start working right as we graduate, or probably even before that, it is so difficult to get into that mindset of like it's okay to just exist. And a lot of people don't have that because we've been brought up from a young age. And also, I mean, like, this is probably, I can't speak for everybody's experience, but like as an Asian person, stereotypically, grades were like the biggest thing in school. And if you didn't get the highest grades, what are you doing? You are less valuable. And so we've been brought up since a very, very young age to base our value on what we can produce. And it is not the best for our well-being. So it's really important to separate yourself from that, in order to for the sake of your well-being. For sure. Yeah.
This, Marie, I could not agree more. What comes to mind, and this is actually something so I love to be in nature as well and speak to nature and thank nature. Again, moving away, and I think the well-being space talks about this, is like from this narrative that we are separate, that we are separate from the planet, that we are separate from each other. And I think on a cellular level, on an intuitive level, we know, and what the science shows is like connection is so important, and that narrative of separation can be so damaging. And I want to share this story in connection to what you shared. Years ago, I went to Notre Dame Law School, and I used to do a lot of running around the lakes. And while I was running, I was that creepy law student that was like talking to the trees, and people were like, who's... they probably thought like, oh, she, oh gosh, it's final time. And so it was funny. And I remember this one time, there were many people running around the lake. It was beautiful weather. And I was looking at the lake and I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, like, look at that. This body of water is reflecting images of everyone. That's what a lake does, it'll mirror. And then it hit me of like, wait, look at that. This lake is reflecting back images, yet it never forgets that it's a lake, right? It doesn't start thinking like, I am the reflection of Krystal. And I give this example to say that so often we go through life and we become the stories, the projections that are placed onto us. So for instance, the story around your value is attached to how much you produce. We take that on, and that becomes so wrapped up in our identity instead of this recognizing of the lake that exists within us, in the sense of like that you are that I am Krystal, that you are Marie, and that you have inherent worth and value outside of what you can produce. And so how do we walk that line of resting in that knowing, as opposed to resting in the stories that then become who we think we are? So that's my contribution there.
Yeah, I love that contribution. Thank you so much for that. That was so well said. And I feel like it also does intertwine very well with what we're talking about today, because a lot of domestic violence survivors lose that self-esteem. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I would love to get your definition of what family is and domestic violence as well.
Yeah. For me, family is a dynamic definition. I grew up, and it's become dynamic over the years. I'm a Caribbean parents born in Jamaica, first generation here in the States, and I was told, or one of the things I was conditioned to believe, was that family is that biological unit your family of origin, those people you grew up with in your household. And that was true. And that was a truth. But for me, I grew up in a family, I'm a third generation survivor of domestic and sexual violence. So I grew up in a family riddled and shaken by trauma and abuse. And, my mom, bless her, as a survivor herself, really tried to give her kids everything that she could, even in ways that she didn't have to give. And so for me, family has been a part of that family of origin, but in recognizing from an early age that there were certain things that my family could not give me because they never had it themselves, it became this really expansive view of what I'd call a chosen family. How do you build what you need outside of that unit, right? Outside of that home of origin. And so, I'd say, my family has blossomed over time. The founder of Rec Center, Linda I would say Linda's my family, and has been a real important person in my life. So many people have become a part of this composition. And then I think to your question on domestic violence, I mean, there's the definition in terms of, at least within the U.S. context, domestic violence. There's a legal definition of domestic violence that, depending on the state, it can include intimate partner violence, so violence that takes place within the context of or with an intimate or former intimate partner in an intimate romantic relationship. Family violence, so it can be violence that takes place within a household between a parent and a child, or a parent and an adult child. In some states, it can even be roommates, also siblings. And so it depends on the legal context. But when I break it down from there, domestic violence is the abuse, the pain, the heartache that happens to an individual. And I'm going to talk about IPV in the context of an intimate relationship that can literally create a rupture in someone's being. And the ripple of, I think that there's so many levels of what violence can look like, the spiritual harm that this can cause an individual, and in addition to the harm within oneself and the harm within the relationship. But I think of it on so many, when I talk to survivors and hear story after story in terms of the impact, that it can be so layered, and often it evolves over time. So that would be what I'd say is my definition of family and DV.
Yeah, very, very complex, taking several different situations into account, because there are, like, every situation is different. There are textbook definitions and there are textbook cases, but the emotions that one's feeling, that's unique to an individual and their own situation, for sure. And the next thing I wanted to establish as well is, how common is domestic violence, at least in your experience working as the executive director at the NYU Center for Violence and Recovery?
Too common. It's so common. I mean, we're talking 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence within an intimate relationship, at least in the context of the United States. An estimated 10 million people every year have been impacted by domestic violence. Intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crimes in the U.S. context. But beyond that, in these numbers, what I think domestic violence is hugely underreported. So actually, my sense is these numbers don't quite reflect the gravity that we're talking about and the pervasiveness of DV. And for a lot of different reasons that I want to speak to. One, domestic violence is deeply stigmatized. And because of that, there's a lot of shame in naming one's experience with domestic violence. I've also found in my own lived experience and in talking to survivors that there's a concept called the intergenerational transmission of violence. So this is this idea that growing up in a violent home or witnessing violence puts you, you're more likely to experience violence and seeing violence be passed down from one generation to the next. And what I've seen is like, I grew up in a family where violence was pretty normal. And so, early on, when I entered my first relationship and was experiencing domestic violence, I knew that I was violated. I knew that this experience, that I was being impacted, that I was being harmed, but I never called it domestic violence. And a part of it was because it felt pretty familiar. And so I think that's another layer of this is when you grow up either being exposed to violence or where violence is passed down from one generation to the next, there can be a minimization in one's own experience of what you are experiencing and even hesitance to name it as domestic violence. I think this is also contextualized by things like race, in terms of, I spent to talk to a lot of women of color, Black women, and this idea of being seen as a victim can feel like an identity that one does not want to subscribe to. And even feeling like a survivor. And so these names that we label people, while for myself, I know identifying as a survivor has been extremely empowering. For some, does not always have that same impact.
Yeah. And I also imagine growing up in homes where domestic violence is very apparent. In those situations, it's also more likely that whoever is the perpetrator would minimize the recipient's experiences a lot of the time. And so being exposed to this kind of treatment over the years would lead to the recipient being desensitized to all of these experiences, basically gaslighting in a sense.
Yeah.
Like it's essentially gaslighting is what it is. Gaslighting because they've been gaslit their whole lives. Maybe it's intentional, maybe it's not. I don't know. Like to to go on a little detour here, I tend to like be very what's the word? I don't want to say empathetic. I don't want to sound like I'm empathetic towards people who perpetrate this issue, but it's always like you'll never know what's going on in their head. Maybe they mean it, maybe they don't. If they don't mean it, then they did like does that mean that is gaslighting? Maybe they just genuinely think that way, that kind of thing. And I assume that well, maybe it's not right to assume, but I assume, well, I just said that maybe it's not right to assume, but I envision that this is the same thought process for a lot of survivors, being like, well, maybe they don't mean it. And if they don't mean it, then maybe it's not domestic violence, and that is a whole process to go through. But back to what we were talking about. I wanted to ask, how much impact does all of what I've said, how much impact does that have on a survivor's initial stage of recovery, initial process of getting out of the violence?
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I think you didn't go off the like it was spot on. It's like we need to talk about love. So we really do, because and I often talk about in the context of my own experience that I loved a man who had caused me incredible harm. And so until we start having that conversation that many survivors deeply love and care for the people who have caused them harm. And so when we, so this is why sometimes this carceral punitive approach doesn't align with the needs of some survivors when they're like, hey, I love him and I just want him to get the help that he needs. I don't want to gender this because of course this happens in all, relationship contexts. But, and so I think when we start, it's so important to talk about that, like while, the systems may be seeing this person as the perpetrator or the offender, a survivor may be seeing them as this is my kid's father. This is the love of my life. And so when that is the paradigm in which I'm looking at you, now, what I desire to take, what accountability and what healing looks like for me in the context of what you have done looks incredibly different. And I think that's important to talk about. In terms of the recovery process, it is multifaceted and multi-layered. And, I think Judith Herman, and she actually just recently came out with another book. Her seminal work was Trauma and Recovery, and came out with a recent a follow-up, and it's Truth and Repair, I believe, by Judith Herman. And she talks about the stages of recovery. And what I like to, so what trauma is at its core is an experience of powerlessness, right? And so when we're talking about domestic violence and where someone has exerted power over you, right? And that's another conversation we need to have, is that our culture does not teach us how to have power, positive personal power. We all need that without taking it away from someone else. And that is something that we need to teach. So back to the domestic violence piece. So what I found with a lot of folks that have caused harm is that there were moments in their lifetime that they felt powerless, and now we're looking for different ways to gain their power back. And what that can look like is exerting power over someone else, and even someone that they're in a relationship with and care for, et cetera. So it's really important. So in terms of the recovery journey, one, survivors need a sense of safety, and safety on all of the levels. And we need to get expansive in and asking survivors. So moving away from assuming what safety means for someone else, and asking survivors, what does safety mean to you? And let's break that down. If physical safety, emotional safety, psychological safety, so survivors need to experience a sense of safety again. And when a relationship has made them feel, and someone has exerted behaviors that has challenged their sense of safety, has ripped their sense of safety from them, survivors need to gain back safety. So that's cute. Another piece, and it ties to the, trauma being an experience of powerlessness, is survivors need to have a sense of agency and autonomy and being able to take their power back. And so this was actually in Linda's earliest work, the founder of the center. It's a 1999 Harvard Law Review article called Killing Her Softly. She talks about the ways in which the system can actually mimic the same similar abuse that a survivor experiencing in their intimate lives by taking choice and voice away from survivors. And so we need to be really careful of that. And it's really important that survivors have an opportunity to build back, to exercise their voice and choice. That could look like, not staying in the relationship. It could look like staying in the relationship, but with certain boundaries. It could look like helping, gaining autonomy and agency over their lives. And that can look like a lot of different things, financially, physically, emotional, all of things. And so that's a really piece. So safety on this, this experience of autonomy and agency and power. And this other piece is essentially being able to rebuild their lives by creating new meaning. And so what often happens, like when violence happens, it's in Howard Zier talks about this, or when harm or crime happens, it is a violation of the self, of one's self-identity and of your worldview. And so that's why, harm can be so devastating. Domestic violence can be so devastating because it is literally creating a rupture in the fabric of who you are and who you thought the world is. And the example would be, I'm Krystal, and I operate in a world that's fair and safe. And now when I experience domestic violence, when I experience this form of violence, one, I don't know who Krystal. There was Krystal before the violence and Krystal after the violence. And then in terms of my worldview, believing that I live in a world that's safe and where no one would cause harm to me, now that's shattered. And so survivors need an opportunity to build back, to rebuild their lives and to find a new sense of meaning and purpose in their lives now that this harm, this incredible, painful harm has taken place. And, for domestic violence, and why it's unique to other kinds of harm is because you may be talking about a pattern over an extended period of time, right? And so, so that recovery process can take that much longer.
Mm-hmm. And with what you said about survivors needing that sense of autonomy and agency, I feel like it's really, really important to emphasize on as well, because I'm not sure if this happens in real life. I imagine it does happen, but I've watched a few. I do watch a lot of TV shows and movies, and it's probably different in real life. I don't know, but I've seen a lot of law enforcement kind of shows where someone in law enforcement will try to persuade the victim or the survivor to persecute this offender and to come out and to reveal themselves and to speak up against this offender. And while that might be good for the case and for putting them potentially behind bars, it's, like what you said, you need to give the survivors a sense of autonomy and agency. And in certain cases, these characters probably, well, it's not real life, but I just imagine this goes on in real life too, would make them feel guilty for not wanting to speak up. And everyone is in their own journey. It's not a linear path. They might not be in a place to do something like that. And then making them feel bad, it could worsen that process, and it just looks really dehumanizing. Dehumanizing, is that a word?
Yes.
Dehumanizing?
Yeah,
Yes, it just
dehumanizing.
looks really dehumanizing. But what would you say is a good way to approach that for those people who are looking from the outside and really want to help do something about it? What's the best way to go about giving survivors that sense of autonomy and agency while letting them know, hey, like, it would be great to do this, but ultimately it's up to you. And if you don't feel safe, then yeah. How would you recommend approaching that?
Yeah, so Marie, so we talk about like, oh my gosh, so many things. So I will answer that, and I also want to respond to what you said, because this is a challenge to our criminal legal system, folks. Our criminal legal system says that it is doing, prosecuting, seeking justice in the name of survivors. We invoke survivors' names very often in terms of why we pursue justice. Yet within our in our current context, survivors' needs are many times are not even a part of the conversation. When you think about crime, it is the state and the perpetrator or the person who's caused the harm or the violence, right? Very, very infrequently is there survivors' needs, their desires, their goals infused into that process. And that's one of the reasons I love restorative justice, because it's a paradigm shift where we are centering the needs of the person who has experienced harm and being really committed to what they see, at what they need and what repair looks like for them and what will make things as right as possible for them. So that's I appreciate you bringing that up, because it is extremely harmful to have a paternalistic approach to survivor needs. It can really impact the healing and recovery journey for survivors, and we need to be mindful of that. Now, to your question of how do we approach this, I think a couple of values or guidelines I'd like to acknowledge from the get-go. One, every survivor is the expert on their own experience. That's a guideline that I hold. Two, that survivor's needs, goals, and voice needs to be centered in what the next steps look like. And this is really important because, and I can name this for myself, I'm someone who, it's very easy, especially when you care about someone and you're well-intentioned and well-meaning, and someone shares with you a story, and it might bring up something in your own personal life where you're like, we're going to do X, right? And so I'm going to do this. This is what needs to happen. And so the other three the third piece that I think a value is humility. In order for us to really practice that every survivor is the expert on their own experience, and that their needs, voice, and goals should be centered in whatever happens next, I have to approach that situation with a sense of humility. And that could mean letting go of what I would have wanted to happen in that situation, right? That might mean, I'm not in the driver's seat, and that can be really difficult for people, but it's something that I would challenge us to do. And so I think from there, in terms of what the conversation looks like, if you hear this is what is happening in the life of a friend or a community member, is starting there. And I think the questions that come up in restorative conferencing can be really helpful. Is asking, if depending on where a survivor is, in terms of if they come to you and are sharing their story, being open to hearing what happened. Survivors need, that can be really important for some survivors, being able to tell their story. And for the challenge for the person who's listening is to listen with compassion, and not minimizing or anyway minimizing or blaming a survivor. This is really, really important. And I also want to name that some of the reasons why we may minimize and say these euphemisms like, everything happens for a reason, is because of our own stuff, right? when you're hearing this really terrifying experience, it can shake your own worldview, right? And these your own feelings can come up around, what if this happened to me? And so it's really important to subside, rest that piece and just be in a space of compassionate, active listening. One of the things that can be really painful for survivors is not just the harm that they experience by, an intimate partner or someone who's caused them harm, but by the bystander. It's a secondary harm, right? Of the people they told the story to and dismissed them, or the friend that they told the story to for the 10th time and they said, when are you going to stop talking about this? That secondary harm, that secondary victimization can be just as painful and brutal. Yeah. And so we need to challenge ourselves to decrease our own resistance and be in a space of compassionate and open listening and asking questions, being in a posture of curiosity around, what do you need? What are your goals? What does repair look like for you? And even before you get to that question, I would be very, in terms of a repair question or what would make things as right as possible for you, getting a sense. I would say that's a very last question. I think the most important piece is understanding, getting a sense of goals and needs, and working with a survivor to support them in actualizing those needs and goals. Another thing that I want to really emphasize is that one of the things we see really often, our research in this area has shown us, is that survivors or folks involved in domestic violence often have weak social support networks. And so in our process, the model that Linda created in 2004, it's called Circles of Peace. It's a restorative justice peacemaking circle process for domestic violence, and is now one of the most effective domestic violence interventions in the United States. And we have a practice of inviting in our community members and support people to help build back the survivors' community support and social support networks. But what we often see when we ask survivors, well, like, who would you like to bring to the circles to support you? Is either they're like, I don't know. I don't have anyone, or the person that I have is the person who's actually caused harm to me. And so talking about that, it's a really big piece of the safety, element of the recovery process, is building back the social support network of survivors is really critical. And I think we don't speak about that enough. That the isolation that survivors can feel, and the need that's there in terms of and how important it is to have a circle of support in your recovery journey.
Yeah, I just really quickly wanted to touch on what you said about the bystanders as well, with people who aren't doing anything. It is my firm opinion, and I know we are a scientific podcast, but we are here talking about how, like, with all the research that has been done, with all the lived experiences, the qualitative data that you have collected, I haven't collected, but we as a whole have collected, it seems that in just sitting there and watching or like witnessing it go on without saying anything or without doing anything, you are choosing to do something. And that's not to say like you have to do the most or call the police or the helpline or go over to the house all the time. It's not to say that you have to do all of that at all, but literally just listening with intent can do wonders for a survivor, because most of what a survivor feels is that powerlessness, that like feeling unseen, that feeling of just being invisible and suffering without anyone caring. So literally just care. Like that's all you need to do. And also with helplines and calling the authorities, etc., I wanted to get your expert opinion on what should be done there. I always felt like it should be done with the survivor's consent, because they should, like you said before, they should have the agency. But yes, tell us a bit about what should be done with the like calling helplines, etc.
Yeah. So, I the bystander piece is huge. And we need to talk about that more. And in my own experience, when I think about my own survivor experience, what happened to me was painful. But I'll never forget that the mother of the person who, as in, this abusive relationship with, when I shared with her what happened, and she knew, I think at that point, she probably, I assume, based on what transpired, that this wasn't new information to her. And I'll never forget this now, years later. And she said, my son will not give you an apology today. And ended up being, I think for her, this person was, she saw her son and was thinking about, how do I protect him? He's about to go to college, all the things. And that was probably one of the most painful experiences I've had. And in that moment, she didn't do anything, but she did something that felt just as violent as our relationship. And so I think that's talking about that's a complex identity of someone not doing something, but also saying something harmful. And I just wanted to acknowledge, the ways in which, we can be complicit supporters in this kind of behavior, especially when it happens to someone that we want to protect and care about, right? And so there's that piece. In terms of, you said something, and I want to make sure to answer your question, Marie. What were you saying? Because then I went off to another tangent.
Yes. I wanted to ask about how we should approach using helplines and when to call the authorities. You did mention making sure not to remove the agency and the power away from survivors. So what should be done around that?
Yeah. So one of the things I hear anecdotally, qualitatively within our work is, survivors are like, I didn't even want I didn't want the police here. My neighbors called the police. And, and I think we need to also talk about the fact that policing has different populations, different racialized bodies have very different experiences with policing. And so what may feel safe to us, safe to someone, because I'm not a survivor that, wanted the police involved in my situation, could actually feel just as harmful or more harmful to someone else. So we really need to, it's a wanting to do something, and, can have the best of intentions. And we also need to, rest that in what it is that this person may want. And so I'm a proponent of asking a survivor what they need, what they want, what their goals are, and letting that be the guide in terms of what happens next. Now, there may be situations where someone is in imminent danger, where getting consent is not something that is accessible. And I think, I want to appreciate that what I'm saying is is guidance, is not the rule. I think that, there's so many different kinds of situations that occur. But at least within my own practice, I work really hard to lean into my survivor-centered impulse in terms of, and as opposed to my impulse that tells me that I need to do what I feel like I need to do right now, and that can be really important. But I believe in that. I don't believe in centering survivors as lip service. Like, I believe it is a praxis. It's a theory and a practice, and that means exercising that in these difficult moments. So it's a value that I carry, and one that is really important to me.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I was just thinking, man, NYU is really fortunate to have you.
Oh, that is.
But just a moment where I'm like, okay, wow, this woman's great, and they are so fortunate to have her. But the next thing I wanted to delve into was the practical side of rebuilding life after domestic violence. We've already talked a lot about the initial stages and the emotional, psychological trauma that comes with it and what should be done there. But a big part of it is also finding new housing, employment, and rebuilding social circles, trying to get more better social support system. So what would you say are the biggest challenges in this phase of recovery, and what resources could survivors tap into here?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is knowing where to start. I think that can feel very overwhelming. And so, in the U.S. context, there are many many communities. There are local victim advocacy agencies or domestic violence agency that do things like provide safety planning, victim advocate support to survivors, resources for housing, etc. And so I think plugging into those resources can be really important. Also, within there are a lot of, at least within the U.S. context, and different countries have their own coalitions, but they're statewide domestic violence coalitions that also can be an arbiter of some of these resources. I think that for those who are open and feel comfortable with accessing those resources, I think then the other piece that I think is super important is this building back social support and that fabric around you. So I'd say, and for a lot of these victim advocacy organizations have survivor support circles. So I'm looking for local survivor support circles. Being in a space that of an affinity space, of folks that have had similar lived experiences that are also in a process of rebuilding their lives can be a really powerful space for survivors, and for survivors that are still in relationship with the people that they've harmed. I know many survivors that are still in some kind of connection or relationship, but still find those support circles really important and meaningful in that in their journey. And that's also something that I think is really unique to domestic violence, is that a lot of folks, especially in the intimate partner violence context, are still living together. And so the question doesn't, it's not a question of how do I escape this person for the rest of my life, or you have a child with someone. Sometimes that is the question. How do I remove myself from this situation and this human being? And sometimes the question is, I can't completely remove myself from this human being. Well, albeit maybe it's financial, or we have a home together, or we have children together. So even if we're not in a romantic relationship, there's still this question of co-parenting. And I think survivor support circles become really important to be able to process those questions as well. And I would also just put a plug on why restorative justice and restorative practices are so important in the context of gender-based violence and domestic violence, so that survivors can have these resources that are not just accessible to them when the criminal legal system is involved. Survivors deserve this kind of support, and we need to make this more accessible for survivors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And what would you say for survivors who are going through this recovery process? What are some habits that you recommend practicing in order to support their journey and their recovery?
Yeah, so many. And I think one, as in a survivor support circle, when I was a student years ago at NYU, and they had support groups, and I went for the first time years ago to process violent experience. It was really powerful, but this came up. Recovery is a lifelong journey. Healing is a lifelong journey, and I think that's really important frame and paradigm shift, because often this narrative of that encourage us to think of things in a linear fashion, like this happened and it's over, or it's been 10 years or 15 years since I had this experience, but it's very real and raw for me, can be really overwhelming and disempowering in terms of feeling like, why am I not there yet? There is no there. This is a lifelong healing recovery journey. And I say that as someone who's on it. And so also giving yourself grace and compassion as you move through all of the stages of what this might look like for you. The other piece is in terms of habits. I think therapy is really, I know it's been very helpful for me. And I think therapy that specializes, that is really useful for folks with trauma. So I'm a proponent of internal family systems. It has been very helpful for me. EMDR has also been really powerful for me, and it's powerful. Has a lot of benefits for survivors of trauma. And of course, cognitive behavioral therapy. And there are also, therapy can be expensive. And so I would also plug, at least I know within the US context, Open Path Collective, which is a resource that allows anyone who is under a certain financial income to get affordable therapeutic options. And so I know that that's been a practice that has been really helpful for me. Also, on the day-to-day practically, but this can be very challenging, is boundaries. Boundaries. And I don't just mean, this, yes, boundaries can be so complex, but I remember one of my first therapists talked about setting boundaries with myself. I would have this really harsh, negative self-talk in the early stages of my recovery journey. And, she said something to me like, you don't get to talk to yourself that way. And I don't know why. It was this moment, I was like, oh my gosh, all my life I talked to myself, I'd seen people talk to, have their own negative self-talk, had this really painful talk within my relationship. And now I'm saying these same things to myself. So boundaries, even with yourself on this recovery journey, I found to be really powerful. And of course, as someone who meditates and is a deep believer in mindfulness, and there's a couple of meditation apps. One, Healthy Minds Innovation, which is a free meditation app. 10% Happier. That is not a free meditation app, but I found it really, it's also a podcast, and that is free with Dan Harris. I found that meditation and mindfulness have been a really helpful practices for me on my healing and recovery journey.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. Now we'll move on to the open mic section. This is your chance to talk about anything that you're passionate about that doesn't have to be related to the topic at all. So feel free to take it away. The floor is yours.
Wow. Oh my gosh. I love this. Well, so much of what I'm passionate about intersects with this, but one of the things two concepts I've been playing with. One, the way in which what I'm going to call carcerality, which is a punishment-based approach, or underneath a fear-based approach, has seeped into so many of our institutions, of our systems, even the ones that purport to help, educate, and serve. And so one of the things that I'm really passionate about is how do we move beyond a carceral or punitive paradigm, and shift towards a paradigm that is restorative. It also connects to this other idea I've been playing with is I am a big proponent of we cannot, our outer worlds are a direct reflection of our inner worlds, meaning that if we want that, we talk so often about why are our institutions, maybe they're punitive or shame based, that our institutions are made up of people. And what we're often seeing is a reflection of some of those elements that exist within us. And so I'm really passionate about doing that inner work to embody some of these practices I'm talking about. I care about around being, what does it mean to be restorative? What does it mean to embody well-being? And it's only when we do that I think, in terms of elements of that, there's elements of compassion and love and rest and grace. It's only when we embody those values that we're able to create those values outside of us. And so for all of the activists, organizers out there, I really want us to be intentional about I think this conversation is happening, but how important it is for us to embody the worlds that we want to create. And that is a daily practice. And so that's my open mic. I'm off my soapbox.
That was a fantastic open mic. Thank you so much, Krystal, for sharing all of that with us. You're doing such great work, and I'm personally really keen to keep up with what you're doing. So if there's anyone out there like me who is interested in finding out more about what you do, where can they go?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Now I have to look up our website. I'm talking right now. You can look us up on Google us. That's it. But the Center on Violence and Recovery website, and it's centeronviolenceandrecovery.org. And check us out. And also, I'm on LinkedIn at Krystal McLeod, KrystalMcleod. And I'm always happy to get LinkedIn messages. And I'm also happy to share my email. It is also on the website. My email is K as in Krystal, A as in Anne, M as in Mary, 794 at NYU.edu. Please, we're so, this work is, we're deeply passionate about this work, and we'd love to collaborate. Movements, visions could not be done on our own. We need to create collaborative exchanges to really be able to usher the change that we want in the world. So always happy to collaborate and be in connection with other folks out there.
Excellent. We'll link all of that, what you said, in the show notes. And if you are in Australia and are or know someone who has experienced or is at risk of family and domestic violence, like I've said in the beginning, call 1-800-737-732, of course, with the survivor's consent, like what we've discussed today. Now, thank you everyone for tuning in to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
You've been listening to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent. Thanks for tuning in.